There is a moment that every scientist dreams of, a moment that Richard Feynman himself experienced more than once in his extraordinary career. It is the moment when you realize that the world is not what you thought it was. It is the moment when the old certainties crumble, and something new, something beautiful, something utterly unexpected emerges from the wreckage. For Feynman, one of those moments came in 1957 at the Chapel Hill Conference on the role of gravitation in physics. He stood before some of the greatest minds of his generation and proposed a thought experiment so simple, so elegant, and so audacious that it would take nearly 70 years for technology to catch up with his imagination. He suggested that if you could place a massive object in a quantum superposition of two locations and let it gravitationally interact with another mass, you could determine once and for all whether gravity obeys the laws of quantum mechanics. If the two objects became entangled, it would be unambiguous evidence that gravity is quantum. If not, gravity might remain fundamentally classical. Now, in the summer of 2026, that thought experiment is no longer a dream. It is becoming feasible through rapid progress in quantum experiments. A landmark paper published in Nature in October 2025 has extended Feynman's original proposal, finding that classical theories of gravity can actually transmit quantum information and generate entanglement through physical, local processes. The unification of gravity and quantum mechanics, one of the most profound open questions in science, is now closer than ever to an experimental test. Feynman's idea from nearly 70 years ago is finally becoming reality, and that is the mind of Richard Feynman in a nutshell. A mind that could see, decades ahead of everyone else, the questions that would one day become the most important questions of all. But Feynman was not just a physicist. He was a philosopher of life, a man who applied the same relentless, playful curiosity to everything he encountered. He said, "The prize is the pleasure of finding the thing out, the kick in the discovery, the observation that other people use it. Those are the real things." The joy was never in the answer itself. The joy was in the asking. The joy was in the process of figuring something out, no matter how trivial the subject might appear to others. He had little patience for prestige, authority, or explanations that couldn't be tested. He famously said, "It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, how smart you are, or what your name is. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong." In that simple statement is the key to science. He was suspicious of explanations that sounded good but didn't cash out in practice. Instead, he emphasized curiosity and intolerance for nonsense. And when things got too stuffy, he preferred playing the bongo drums. Feynman had a strong instinct to understand things by doing them, not by reading about them. Just as with physics, he didn't want descriptions, he wanted participation. Curiosity didn't need justification. As a teenager, he repaired radios without schematics. In his last act as a public figure, he exposed the cause of the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Despite being ill with cancer, he cut through NASA's flawed reasoning, insisted on speaking to engineers rather than administrators, and demonstrated O-ring failure with a simple glass of ice water on live television. In his mind, fixing radios and explaining the Challenger disaster were the same problem. In both cases, authority had obscured reality, and a simple experiment was enough to reveal it. The Challenger investigation remains one of the most powerful demonstrations of Feynman's philosophy in action. The disaster emerged from a combination of factors, one of which was the failure of a small component known as the O-ring. O-rings had failed before, but the flights had succeeded, despite the damage. NASA executives had convinced themselves that the risk was acceptable. They had allowed a culture of complacency to obscure the truth. Feynman refused to accept that. He insisted on asking real questions and following the physics. He showed the world that physics cannot be negotiated. He revealed that propulsion experts, materials scientists, program managers, and executives were not aligned. Not because they lacked knowledge, but because they lacked a shared environment where concerns could be voiced, heard, and acted upon. Reading how the investigation was carried out through Feynman's own detailed writings, one cannot avoid a larger reckoning with organizational culture and accountability. When a tragedy occurs that might have been prevented, How do we face inconvenient truths and preserve them as lessons? Feynman's legacy is not just the physics. It is not just the Nobel Prize. It is the way he lived. He is the model of the curious scientist who really lived by his creed. The pleasure of finding things out. A scientific mind is a curious mind bent towards problem solving. This mindset is present in children and is often beaten out of them by casual distraction, poor education, or bad role models. Most of us want to learn, but we gradually lose this instinct as we grow up. Feynman did not lose it. He nurtured it. He protected it. He celebrated it. He showed that incredibly difficult problems, such as quantum electrodynamics, can be solved with clarity of thought alongside hard work. He showed that satisfaction with dead ends and non-answers should be rejected with venom. Pursue the truth to its end and search for the best answers possible. Along with all his scientific accolades, Feynman's legacy is to have shown the power of relentless and fearless thinking. But Feynman was not a man without contradiction. He was a man of contrasts, lively, irreverent, and deeply suspicious of explanations that sounded good but didn't cash out in practice. He had little patience for intellectual laziness or inconsistency and was known to be a relentless pursuer of truth with a singular contempt for untidiness of thought. He was as anti-establishment as one could ever be. And yet, he was also a man of profound emotion, of deep and abiding love. His first wife, Arlene, died of tuberculosis when she was only 25. Feynman was devastated. A year and a half after her death, he wrote her a letter that was discovered only after his own death. He wrote, "Darlene, I adore you, sweetheart. I know how much you like to hear that, but I don't only write it because you like it. I write it because it makes me warm all over inside to write it to you." He wrote, "I want to tell you I love you. I want to love you. I always will love you." And then, at the very end of the letter, he wrote something that reveals the depth of his honesty, his refusal to pretend that loss did not hurt. He wrote, "Please excuse my not mailing this, but I don't know your new address." This is the unsentimental yet deeply human wisdom of Richard Feynman. He did not try to airbrush his feelings into something comfortable. He did not pretend that loss did not hurt. He simply observed his own heart with the same honesty he brought to physics. And he accepted that pain is part of the deal. If you want to care about things, you will sometimes hurt. That is not a reason to stop caring. It is the price of admission. So how do we apply Feynman's philosophy to our own lives? How do we live with the same honesty, the same curiosity, the same refusal to be fooled? The answer lies in a simple but profound practice that has come to be known as the Feynman Technique. The core idea is devastatingly simple. If you cannot explain a concept in plain, simple terms, you do not really understand it. The technique is a learning loop, not a to-do list. Each stage is a deliberate cognitive intervention designed to dismantle the illusion of competence. It forces you to confront what you do not know, to expose the gaps in your understanding, and to rebuild your knowledge from the ground up. Working through a problem and then explaining your answer out loud is a simple, effective way to apply the Feynman technique in everyday practice, turning routine work into meaningful learning. This technique is not just for physics. It is for everything. It is for understanding why a relationship failed. It is for understanding why you feel anxious in certain situations. It is for understanding why you believe what you believe. Strip away the jargon. Strip away the labels. Watch the bird, not the name of the bird. This is the essence of what Feynman learned from his father, who took him for walks in the woods and taught him that knowing the name of a bird in Italian, Portuguese, Chinese, and Japanese taught you absolutely nothing about the bird itself. The name is not the knowledge. The label is not the understanding. The real knowledge lives in the details, in the observation, in the patient, honest work of figuring things out for yourself. Feynman's philosophy has never been more relevant than it is today. We live in an age of information overload, of confident opinions and quick answers, of social media echo chambers and algorithmic confirmation bias. We are constantly bombarded with claims that demand our belief, and we are constantly tempted to choose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. Feynman's voice cuts through all of this noise. He reminds us that intellectual honesty is the highest virtue. He reminds us that we must be willing to question everything, especially our own most cherished beliefs. He reminds us that the goal is not to be right, but to understand. That way of thinking, forged long before machine learning and neural networks, turns out to be uncomfortably relevant today. If Feynman were alive and wandering through our technological landscape, it is hard to imagine him standing on a stage at an AI product launch. He disliked hype. He was suspicious of grand promises delivered before the details were understood, of applause standing in for questions. Instead of unveiling a finished product, he would likely say something like, "I don't really know what this thing does yet. That's why I'm interested in it." He might take the demo apart and break it before fixing it and putting it back together. That alone would drain the room of hype and dampen the mood of anyone hoping for a smooth pitch. It is easier to imagine him sitting in the last row of a darkened auditorium, notebook in hand, watching carefully. On the screen, colorful animations glide past, neural networks glowing, data flowing, arrows pointing confidently upward, unencumbered by error bars, a demo that works beautifully, provided nothing unexpected happens. A speaker explains that the system understands language, reasons about the world, discovers new knowledge. Each claim is met with nods and polite applause. You can see Feynman being tempted to rise and ask a deceptively simple question: "How do you know?" But Feynman, new to this spectacle, would wait. He would listen for the moment when someone explained what the machine does when it fails, or how one might tell whether it truly understands anything at all. He would notice that the demo works flawlessly, once, and that no one asks what happens when the input is strange, incomplete, or wrong. He would hear words doing a great deal of work, and he would wonder whether they correspond to anything real. This is the Feynman method applied to the greatest technological challenge of our time. He would not be impressed by the hype. He would not be swayed by the confidence of the experts. He would ask the simple, devastating questions that everyone else was too polite or too intimidated to ask. He would demand to see the evidence. He would demand to know how the system performs under stress. He would demand to know what it means to understand something. He would apply the same skeptical, curious, rigorous approach to AI that he applied to everything else in his life. In fact, Feynman's principle of scientific integrity has already been applied to AI ethics. A June 2026 paper in Frontiers in Digital Health draws on Feynman's foundational principle, articulated in his 1974 Caltech commencement address, Cargo Cult Science, to develop a practical, disclosure-oriented ethical framework for AI in digital mental health. The neurodiversity paradigm provides a critical stress test. Growing empirical evidence indicates that AI tools trained on narrow behavioral and linguistic norms carry substantial risk of misrepresenting neurodivergent users. The paper proposes 5 criteria for what it calls the Feynman honesty standard: scope clarity, population limit disclosure, uncertainty communication, role integrity, and participatory co-development. The analysis concludes that the field will be judged not only by algorithmic performance, but by its candor about what these systems know, miss, and cannot do. Feynman's voice is shaping the future of technology, even decades after his death. Feynman also had a profound appreciation for beauty. He believed that understanding the universe should not make it less beautiful, but more beautiful. He gave the example of a flower. An artist might look at a flower and see its colors and its shape. A scientist looks at the same flower and sees the cellular machinery, the evolutionary history, the quantum mechanics of the light bouncing off the petals. Does that scientific knowledge make the flower less beautiful? Feynman said no. It makes it more beautiful. It adds layers of meaning. It allows you to see the flower not just as a static object, but as a dynamic process, a story unfolding over millions of years. Knowledge should not kill wonder. It should deepen it. For Feynman, investigating the intelligence of nature was not about finding a final, absolute truth, but rather about appreciating its beauty and harmony through a continuous process of discovery. He viewed this higher intelligence as a vibrant, interactive, incredibly complex system operating as a unified, seamless, and unpredictable whole. Feynman died in 1988, but his voice still echoes in every lecture hall, every laboratory, every quiet room where someone sits with a problem they cannot yet solve. He would not want you to worship him. He would not want you to memorize his quotes. He would want you to do what he did, to look closely at the world, to ask your own questions, to make your own mistakes, and to find your own joy in the act of understanding. He would want you to watch the bird, not the name of the bird, and then, maybe to smile and say, "Isn't that interesting?" This is the heart of the mind of Richard. It is a philosophy of radical curiosity. It is a refusal to accept easy answers. It is the courage to look silly while trying to understand something. It is the humility to admit that you might be wrong. And it is the joy of finding things out, not because you have to, but because you cannot help it. Feynman called curiosity a disease. He said, "I have this disease. I need to know." But it is the most beautiful disease in the world. It is what separates a life of passive consumption from a life of active creation. So go ahead, ask the question, follow the curiosity, make the mistake, admit the error, try the new dish, watch the bird. Do not worry about what other people think. Do not worry about looking foolish. Do not worry about being wrong. Worry only about being honest. Worry only about being curious. Worry only about leaving the door to the unknown ajar. That is the mind of Richard. That is the only motivation you will ever need.